here in China, obviously, air quality is a very important topic. What role can tall buildings specifically play in combating China's air quality crisis and similar air quality issues around the world?
Sure. So, I mean, you're exactly right. Air quality is a huge issue in China, and I think tall buildings can play a role in that the kinds of technologies that they can deploy are really going to be really turning the industry on its head. So in other parts of the world, issues like natural ventilation has been often used as a means of reducing energy consumption. So you're pumping in lots and lots of fresh air into the space. In a market where you have, or an industry or a location where you have air quality problems, you really don't want to be doing that. You're going to be having to look at ways of how you can treat that air, to filter that air, and to be recycling that through. So we're seeing a lot of buildings that are coming up with very, very high-end technology, the sort of air filtration equipment that you might see in a hospital being applied to an office scenario. So it's a big issue that they are looking at. Having said that, buildings are also responsible for probably 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So if there's a way that they can reduce that greenhouse gas emission via energy reduction and other means like that, then that can have a big impact on air quality in the Chinese market.
Mm-hmm. So two-pronged approach. One is at the source of most of the emissions being from coal plants, so reducing energy consumption or advocating for or somehow moving the needle on renewable energy would be one way, and then the other is technological inputs on the buildings themselves to filter for the residents there.
You're exactly right, and the way that I look at it is that when it comes to buildings, there's really two sides of this. It's a supply and demand issue. So a lot of what I do is focusing on energy reduction and on reducing environmental impacts, but if you can address that at the head end from a supply side, so if I can green my electricity generation and move more quickly towards solar and wind and other technologies like that, it doesn't mean that I can have an inefficient building, but it does address a large part of the issue when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So it's still a good goal for us to have an efficient building, but we're addressing part of the problem when it comes to the emissions at its source.
What are some of the most promising technologies that might enable a net zero energy skyscraper? And do you think a net zero skyscraper is even an attainable goal?
Well, we know that net zero is already happening now at a smaller scale. So there's a lot of projects around the world, including in Singapore and other markets like that, where they are doing that. So I guess the way that I look at it is that how are they getting to net zero in these smaller projects, and what can we do to scale that up to a bigger scale, to a bigger site? So a net zero building is not one that doesn't use any energy. It's one that uses a lot less energy, and then it either generates its own supply or it uses renewable power. So the first thing you need to be doing is saying, well, what can I do to make my building as efficient as possible? So in large part, we know the answer to that question. It's the same sort of techniques that we've been using in smaller buildings and less complex buildings. We're just doing it on a much larger scale. The flip side to that is that the megatall buildings are going to have a much higher energy impact to begin with. Just the sheer volume of people that are needing to be moved around a space, pumping air in, pumping, heating and cooling. It's something that we do acknowledge is a big impact. So again, it comes back to the issue about renewable energy. If we can move more quickly towards renewable energy from a supply side, then we're addressing this issue again from that two prong. So we're cutting off, we're addressing it from a demand perspective in an efficient building, and we're also addressing it from a supply side. Having said that, I'm not necessarily sure that tall buildings are really the major focus here. So what we have seen, and this isn't in the context of a net zero building, but what we've seen in the past is that the pendulum really swung out to the side when it came to green technologies. So there was a race towards LEED Platinum and other rating tools in other markets. And what that meant was that plenty of building operators and designers were over-investing in technology which wasn't really matched for that building. One of them was trigeneration. So in my home market, Australia, where I'm originally from, trigeneration was something that was seen as this great way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Australia uses a lot of coal to provide electricity. So they were switching to these generators that were running on natural gas. So immediately you drop your greenhouse gas emissions. It was also providing these other benefits of heating and cooling to the building. So it sounds great. But what we found was that the technology was particularly suited for buildings that ran 24 hours a day, like a hospital, something that had a constant load throughout the day. So in an office building that runs 8 till 6 or something like that, it doesn't run nearly as effectively. We also found was that the equipment was being sized to deal with peak loads in the building, but then during off-peak or shoulder periods it wasn't running effectively, or we're having excess heat, generated there. So do we turn around and blame trigeneration? No, the technology is great. It's just being used in the wrong application. So when I look at green buildings, I'm constantly asking that question of, is this a technology which is adding to that building in the long term? Is it something which we're going to look back on and say that was a great decision? Or is it something we're going to look back on and say, you know what, maybe we went too far. Maybe we over-invested in that and we needed to back that off a little bit.
What's the appropriate investment or technology, right, and not just the newest? Exactly.
I think if you are looking for the newest technologies, you don't have to look very far. There's all sorts of products out there that look great, but is that something that really is going to add value to the building? I think that the balancing act needs to be between doing enough so that there actually is a benefit, but not doing so much that you're creating a building which is complex or difficult to run, or in the worst cases, more expensive.
Yeah, and when it comes to striking that balance, are there changes in the relationships between designers, government, developers, or new structural changes in how those sectors cooperate to achieve sustainable vertical urbanism, as you would define it?
Sure. So I think the biggest change that I've been seeing is that property managers and property operators are getting engaged much earlier on. So in the past, when we were building simpler buildings, it was the case that designers and architects would finish construction and hand the keys over to the operators, and they'd say, "There you go, have a good time." When we're talking about these mega tall buildings now, that's simply not going to cut it. There is so much to learn that you need to get the operations team on a lot sooner, so that they can actually really understand the grand vision that those architects and designers had, how to operate that site effectively. But that's also a two-way street, so that the operations team can provide inputs back to the designers to say, well, I see what you're doing here, I see what you're trying, you're trying to push the boundaries with this technology or that technology, but from our perspective as an operator, that's going to be expensive, or that's going to be another maintenance element that needs to be added to our long list of things we need to look at, or have you thought about doing it a different way? So it's not saying that one school of thought is right and the other one's wrong. I think that both groups, or all of these groups, have a lot to add. So it's about getting them engaged early on so that dialogue is really a two-way discussion.
As head of sustainability for JLL's North Asia division, how has green building changed in China over the past 5 years?
Sure. Well, I think China is really learning very, very rapidly. China may have been a little bit slower to the party when it comes to green buildings compared to other markets, but that doesn't mean, if they're starting 10 years behind some other locations, that doesn't mean they're going to need 10 years to catch up. Very quickly what we're seeing is that China and other parts of Asia are really a hotbed of activity when it comes to tall buildings and sustainable tall buildings. You just need to look at some of the statistics from this conference that, this huge percentage of buildings now are in Asia, and that's only going to grow in the coming years. So in the past, it's been the case that property operations teams and designers may have looked elsewhere in the world, to the US, to Australia, to Europe, about what are the latest trends in sustainability, what are the things that we should be doing. I think now, and very much so in the years to come, we're actually going to be looking to Asia to say, well, this is the home of tall buildings. This is the place to go for that kind of knowledge. And in some ways, that can be an export commodity for Asia and for China.
That's interesting. How do you see that playing out?
Well, if you look at it now, you think, well, a lot of the buildings that are designed in China and Asia are Western firms. They're Western architects, American architects coming in, and that's great, because they've got something to share. They've been doing this for a lot longer, particularly when it comes to sustainability. So they are bringing a new perspective on things that perhaps is not as well developed in the Chinese market, but that is switching very, very quickly. It's not that the Chinese are sitting back and letting this unfold around them. They're learning as quickly as possible. So they're consuming all that information as much as they can, and they're trying to replicate that. So we're seeing some great Chinese architectural firms, some great construction projects coming up, and some really fantastic projects to work on. So I think in some ways, in 5 or 10 years' time or 20 years' time, if somebody in the US or Australia or Europe says, you know what, I'm going to build the next tall building, where do I look to for information on where that's happening? Well, you're going to look where there's the most of those tall buildings, right? And that's right here in Asia.
And as you look out 10, 20 years, probably a lot of the innovations will be things we can't think of right now. But what trends maybe occurring now or starting off now are most interesting or exciting to you when it comes to tall building design?
Sure. Well, in fact, I would actually say that it's not just the design
And
element.
development.
I would also include existing buildings. So I think that to some extent, sustainability has been historically focused on the top end of the market, the new buildings, the mega projects, the skyscrapers, the big corporate clients that can pay for this kind of stuff. But what about all those other buildings that are sitting out there? You look out the window and you see hundreds, if not thousands, of buildings around, around Shanghai.
And this is a question we were going to ask as well. So what do you do with all those buildings?
Well, I think that there's huge opportunities there. They were probably built in a period where sustainability was not as important, where energy costs may have been lower, where the knowledge in the industry was not quite so great. So going in and looking at these buildings, there's a great opportunity to improve them and to bring them up to modern standards. Can they compete with a new project? That's something that the industry is grappling with right now. Do we knock something down and start over again just because my building is 10 years old and may not have all the features of the building down the road or not? Plenty of our clients are coming to us and they're saying, you know what, I've got a building that's 5 years old or 10 years old, and now I want to talk about LEED. I want to talk about LEED existing building. I want to do what it takes to get my building on song when it comes to sustainability. And partly that's because they want to reduce costs and they want to have a great tool to engage with their tenants. But they're also competing. They're competing with these mega projects that are coming out of the ground now or in the next few years. So their tenants, they're acutely aware. They're acutely aware that their tenants are looking at these other projects saying, do I stay or do I go? This new building may have nicer features and more amenities and closer to train lines and, the latest architecture. So the existing buildings need to work extra hard, or else they're going to be finding that they're losing tenants. And sustainability is one of those key trends there. So I think there will be a big push towards existing buildings over the coming years. Air quality is another huge issue. I think that particularly in China, there's an awareness now that something has to be done. So now we are seeing companies that are actually asking questions about, do I want to relocate my staff from city X to city Y or somewhere else, or I'm having trouble finding staff in this location, and one of the attributes is around air quality. So I think there's a rising wave of people saying, you know what, we need to do something about that. Right. And we can't change the world. We look after property, so we need to work within our own realm. But that's a pretty big realm. Property is responsible for about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. So, if we say we control roughly a third of the emissions that are going on, and we can reduce that, then that's a pretty significant impact.
Do you see property owners, building managers, developers still prizing LEED as the best benchmark for green building, or is there a better or a different way forward? How do you see the rise of alternative certification systems for green building?
Sure. Well, look, it's a busy marketplace. I think that LEED is still very much the dominant rating tool in the US and in fact in China. I believe that China is one of the largest markets for LEED outside of North America. So it's definitely the leading tool. It's a great tool, but it's not perfect. So there are other tools that are out there. China has developed its own rating tool. Singapore and other markets like that have done the same. To me, I look at a rating tool as a guide, and I think some of the problems we see with rating tools are when people see them as a recipe book. They say, here's this long list of things that I need to tick off. That's not the way that it's intended to be. So that's not LEED's fault. It's not any other rating tool's fault. It's a matter of designers looking at that critically and saying, these are a whole range of options that are available to me. Which are the right ones that I should pick? So I think LEED is continuing to remain out in front. Others are trying hard, but in some ways that's almost a moot point. It doesn't matter which tool has precedence, which one has the greatest market acceptance. It's that ability for designers to use that in a meaningful way and not go chasing points. That's when LEED or any other rating tool becomes less valuable, less meaningful, when it is about tick a box or get a nice certificate that you can put on the front door.
Right. What's something else that's on your mind lately, or that's been exciting or interesting?
Well, I guess one of the challenges that I am seeing is that although China is learning very rapidly and they are adopting some of the best practices from other markets, they're also repeating some of the same mistakes. So commissioning is the classic example. That in other markets outside of Asia, commissioning is often poorly done or not done at all. And what it means as a building operator is that we come through and then have to pick up the pieces, or are left with a building which is never really operating in line with the original design intent. And in parts of Asia and China where there's such a tight construction time frame, there's so much pressure to get the building built, to get it tenanted, that kind of thing, commissioning is one of the first things to go.
And commissioning is what?
Oh, commissioning in terms of making sure that the plant and equipment, so first of all the designers are coming through and making sure that that's designed correctly, but then making sure that's installed correctly and that it's going to operate correctly, so that, you know, and it's all sorts of silly things that, you know, fans can be connected up badly, or the BMS isn't pointing to the right things, so that when you come in you're looking at information on a screen or believing the building is operating a particular way. In fact, it's not, you know, and it's not because you're relying on information which hasn't been calibrated correctly. So that to me is one of the simplest things that can be done better, but it remains a challenge in the industry, particularly because of the tight construction timeframes.
Just ensuring that the building operates as intended.
Yeah, yeah. Which sounds incredibly simple.
It
you
is,
say, well, the designer spent so much time and effort on designing this beautiful building, and then if you say, well, if we cut corners on the construction side of that and mean that we're actually not delivering what they intended, it's a little bit like designing a Ferrari and then putting training wheels on it, or, you know, plastic doors or something like that. You know, it's actually not delivering on the original design intent, and therefore it's not going to operate the way the designer's meant it to. So that's a big loss in my mind. And when it comes to LEED and other green building rating tools, I think it's imperative on the property industry to really push that forward, because, you know, if we start to see buildings that are designed with sustainability in mind but don't operate as effectively as they could, people will lose faith in that. You know, people will start to look at that and say, you know what, that was a nice idea, but it didn't really work. And it's coming back to those things about making sure that the whole system works as well as it can. You know, we know how to design green buildings well. We know how to deliver them well, so let's do that well. And then let's operate them as effectively and as efficiently as we can.
Yeah, when you say we know how to do them well, it does seem, certainly there's been a huge change in just maybe about 10, 15 years of building since LEED has been around. Do you think there's been enough, though? Because at the same time, there's so many other trends that green building is kind of fighting against, population growth and all sorts of rising reasons for rising carbon emissions, despite, you know, knowledge of for 20 years of the scale of climate change.
Yeah.
So do you think it's happening fast enough, or is there going to be some tectonic shift needed here?
Well, I think on one hand, the information is out there. So we know how to design green buildings very effectively. Are we doing it everywhere? That's maybe another question. So when we talk about tall and mega tall projects, that's the top end of town. You know, it's the big corporate clients, the big investors that can afford this kind of thing and that take the time and effort to do that.
And that need the credibility because they're high-profile projects.
That's right. You know, they're looking to lease their space out to tenants that pay a lot for rent. So of course they're going to be pushing the market in that direction, and that's great. And there's a trickle-down effect from that as well. It's a little bit like the latest iPhone or the newest car. You know, the features that are attached to that mega project sooner or later will make their way down to other asset types, but that's a little bit slow.
Sure.
You know, what happens in the interim to those B and C grade assets or residential buildings or low-income housing, things like that, you know, frankly, the market is in a very different place. And that's where I think that there's a bottom-up approach from a government perspective. So top-down is a trickle-down effect for new technologies and new techniques. Bottom-up is around raising the minimum standards. So that doesn't mean that the government has to mandate LEED or something like that, but it can mean that they look at the building codes. They can look at that and say, well, what are the minimum lighting requirements that we should have, or lighting efficiencies we should have? What are the minimum insulation levels that we should have in these kind of projects? So that they're constantly raising the bar of those raising the minimum standards, as well as incrementally looking at what are other incentives and you know, carrots and sticks that they can offer to the mid-range there. You know, when I look at green buildings, we know how to do it at the top end of the market, but we aren't doing it everywhere. So therefore, shouldn't we be looking to plug those gaps? You know, shouldn't we be looking at those existing buildings or the lower grade buildings or that sort of thing and saying, what are the missing parts? We know how, why aren't we doing it? And is that an incentive? Is it some sort of other government scheme like that? You know, I'm sure there's a whole range of opportunities, but as an industry looking at that gap, that's how we're going to see the tectonic shift.